recording.
Recording in progress.
Oh. We're recording.
Like Bob froze. Mm.
Bob, we're recording. You can go ahead.
Start recording. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
People hear me? Good.
Yeah.
Yep. Can you hear me? I
I'm
said
not-
we're all set. You can go ahead.
I'm not getting any sound at all.
I can hear you.
I'm gonna leave and come back in.
Can you hear us now, Bob?
Bob signed off and was going to sign on again.
I can't hear any. Can
What happens if
people
you-
can hear me? I can't hear anything.
We hear you.
We don't have a chat room. So
This has happened
He
to me
should,
before.
Athena, he should check his little audio button. Maybe he still has it turned off from last night.
It looks like he's connected to audio, but Kathy, why don't you get started and I'll try and connect with Bob and figure out what's going on.
Okay. As a very temporary chair, we're recording. I'm calling the December. Are you back?
Well, I can't. Kathy, can you open the meeting and I'll reboot my computer and try again.
Yes. All right. Kathy is calling the meeting to order on whatever date it is. Okay.
December 17th.
The Finance Committee, 3 o'clock is called to order, and to make sure everyone can hear and be heard, which we've just discovered one critical person can't, I will just call out everybody else as I see them on the screen, since we're doing this virtually. Mandy?
Present.
Andy?
Present.
Tom?
Present.
Bernie?
Present.
Alicia?
Here.
And well, I might as well check to make sure. Melissa, you can hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay. So I'm at a disadvantage because I don't have the agenda in front of me. And so I don't remember, Athena, whether we start with public comments.
It is typically the first. Yep.
Yep.
Okay. And I think the main agenda today is to talk about the models as they relate to the 4 big buildings, but capital more generally. So while we're waiting for Bob, I'm going to open it for public comments. And if you have a comment, please raise your hand. We have 4 attendees right now: Dave Zomek, Lynn Griesmer, Maria Kopekis, and
Oh, we don't read the names of the people in the audience.
We started doing that in the school building committee, and planning committee does it, Athena. So I was just going to tell people who's there. Right now, I don't see any hands up. All right, so then I think we will proceed with the agenda. And I don't know how, I hadn't talked with Bob before at the meeting on how he wanted to proceed, but it might make sense for Melissa to first walk us through the models one more time. We had a good presentation at the council meeting, but it was a while ago, and we didn't have a long discussion, I don't think, at all at finance yet. So Melissa, if that works for you, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay.
I mean, anyone else can chime in if there's another way of, we'd have to, Athena, there is a packet that we could pull up, so she could be talking off the packet. And I think the main thing is to look at that we'd like to talk of some of the assumptions that went into it, but getting a little bit more concrete about what's feasible with other capital that we have in the pipeline, looking out over the next multiple years, as well as these two buildings, DPW and fire.
Oh, just gonna share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So, okay, so I haven't looked at this in a while either. So, this was a presentation that we gave about a month ago regarding the 4 major building projects that we have. Specifically, the elementary school, which I believe is moving forward, and the Jones Library, which we will have more definitive information on in the next few weeks, I'm assuming, and then, you know, what to do about the specifically the fire station, EMS station, and the DPW building. So we had presented that we thought that the available sites for those 2 locations were going to be Hickory Ridge at for the fire station, and the current location of the DPW to rebuild a facility there, smaller than the needs that the previous study had indicated, because of the size of this available space at the current DPW site. But we were going to continue to use multiple sites to support the DPW as it is now, with some satellite sites at Ruxton, and possibly wastewater and water sites. So that's the overview. And I think, do you want to just get into the 4 possible scenarios? Is that what you're looking?
Yeah, I think that would make sense. And then I have questions, and this is also Bernie and Tom were not at the initial presentation. And one of the things we've been looking at is what might be possible given, and I guess the background is we have a certain amount of money in the capital reserve that we can start drawing on when we start to talk about DPW and fire. And so it's a combination of what's a projected cost of these 2 facilities. And then Melissa has these 4 models on ways of attacking it. So unless I hear anyone else wanting to proceed differently, I think giving us a quick summary of the 4 models would make sense.
Hey, Kathy, this is Bob. I'm back. I can hear everybody. Thanks.
Okay, great. So Bob, I jumped in with having Melissa bring up what we heard at the council. I opened it for public comments and there were none. So
Okay.
we're jumping right in. And I thought at this point, just refreshing all our minds of what is in these 4 models, that then we can talk about what our questions are, but what other information we think we need to have before we say, let's go with one of these or a variant on one of these.
Right.
Is that okay with you?
That's good. Yes. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, Melissa, the floor is yours.
Okay. So the four models were, one was to, because it had been talked about in previous committee meetings about decreasing the standard capital allocation from the 10.5% of the levy to the 10%. And all of the models, just so that we're clear, all of the models have a 3 million to fund additional capital not already sort of in the pipeline as either issued debt or authorized unissued debt. The second one was to maintain the capital allocation at 10.5 and to have the 3 million. The third option was to sort of delay the start of the projects, allowing us to grow the amount of levy capacity so that we had more room in the to support the capital, and we were less dependent on the reserves. And the fourth option was a option to pay a portion of the fire station, is what we use as the example, to in cash reserves to move the project forward. And all of those, all four of those models have a use of the reserves that we have in place.
And Melissa, can you remind us what we currently have in the capital reserve and what we have in the general reserve?
All right, yep. So there's 11 million in the, or 11.6 million in the capital reserve. I believe, I can't remember right now off the top of my head what's in the regular capital, the regular stabilization, but I think it's around 10 or 13, something like in that range. I can look it up in the
That's
next
okay.
few minutes. And well, we'll get to it when we get to it. So this first is where we decrease the ongoing capital to 10%. And the way that these models work is that the green here is existing debt and projected debt. The yellow is ongoing capital, meaning new cash capital or new debt that we don't have projected in the green. The purple is the library. And then the gray is the DPW and the red is the fire station. And this use of the black bar below the line is use of reserves in order to maintain be able to keep up with the spending without using more than 10 point, well, in this case, 10% of the capital. So this black line that grows along the chart here is our ability to spend for capital within that 10%, going out to 2057. So in this model, we would use $15.5 million of the reserves, so more than we have in the capital stabilization at this time. And so either some new free cash in future years or the current stabilization in order to maintain this funding model through to 2037 is when we will stop using the cash capital. So it will go from the year 2020 for 10 years, basically, for this model here. In the next model, this is, whoops, I skipped one. This is to keep the percentage of the levy used on capital at 10.5 that we've been doing over the last few years. And in this model, we use 11.2 essentially $1 million of the capital stabilization, which happens to fit nicely into what we have currently saved. And that would last for about 8 years. We would draw it down, to use within the purpose. Again, this model, the new capital that we're putting on is $3 million. And we have learned that that $3 million, it starts at $3 million in 2026, but grows to over time by 2.5%, like with the levy, essentially slightly less than the levy, so that we can increase it a little bit over time. The third model is to delay the start of these projects, which for this model, I did build in a cost escalator to increase the cost of the 2 buildings that would be delayed. So that would cost, the overall cost of the project would be slightly more. And then this, because we have allowed growth of the tax levy, uses slightly less, 10.5 million of the capital reserves in order to keep that under that, keep the spending for capital within the 10.5% of the levy. And then this final option, was attractive, I know, to some people in the council because it is the least expensive option of the projects in overall costs, and that has to do with not financing $20 million. The issue, of course, with that is that we don't have $20 million kind of laying around to use. So if the world changed and we did tomorrow, then this would be a great option. But right now, to do this would drain most of our reserves. But the ongoing day-to-day capital expenditure is easier to fit into the model because the borrowing doesn't go out. In all 4 of these models, we did an estimate of the borrowing of the over 30 years for both the DPW and the EMS fire facilities. I only did 20 years for the library because we are only financing the 15 million of that. This is sort of a summary of the impacts. Again, here you can see that we save a great deal of money. Financing is expensive, but it does make a lot of the bigger projects possible, just like we do in our personal financing. And then I did say that my preference, of course, was Model 2 because it aligned with our savings to date. I think because I anticipate that there might be unforeseen delays, I don't think delaying the project at this time is the best use of our planning, because I think that the costs continue to run away from us the way that when this presentation was given to you several years ago, the cost for both of these projects was significantly less. I put in what I thought we could afford and what might be possible, knowing that when we get true designs on these, that information may change. I'm not an architect or an engineer, so best guess at this time. I mean, I did get some help from Bob Parent on these numbers, but they are real sort of ballpark numbers.
Bob, you're back to chair, correct?
Yeah, okay, yeah. Okay, Melissa, thank you. Andy, you have a question or comments?
Yeah, I was curious when you looked at Model 3, because the two that I was looking at most closely was Models 2 and 3, but in the delay, you built in the factor, which is in the software itself, to figure out the additional building costs over time
Mhm.
for delay. But I was wondering whether there are other delay costs or risks, financial risks that come with delaying the project. Are there maintenance costs on these two older buildings that just exist because of the maintenance because of their age, and they continue? Are there risk factors in further failures in the buildings that need to be accommodated for because they're still in use? Was any of that analysis thrown in?
I mean, I'll speak for myself, Andy. No, I think those are real concerns. Not the ongoing costs of maintaining the buildings that are failing is not in this analysis at all. It was only these presentations only look at um, building costs, not the sort of how do we get there, and how much money have we spent even in the last 5 years on maintaining these buildings that are struggling, you know. So there are additional risks, and I would say that the risks of of financing is a real one too. Like we know that building costs are rising and have been rising very steeply in the last few years. Again, I do not work in the construction field, but I don't see anything in the horizon that seems to indicate that that is going to change anytime soon. So I built in some small escalator costs into those construction projects based on information I got from Bob Parent, but that's the information over the past few years and not what might be coming that we don't know about. And I know that the other thing we might need to look at is rising interest costs too. So that is something I'm fairly familiar with. But as the economy changes and we're starting to get lower interest on deposits and higher interest on lending, that's true for the municipal bond market as well. And so that the trend has been, it had been falling for quite some time, and now it is rising again, and I think it's an unknown. So
Okay, Kathy?
Uh, yeah. Melissa, I have sort of, if I focus just on Model 2, in Model 2, you've got DPW starting in 2026 with that debt hitting in 2027 and fire 1 year later. So I'm not asking you to answer each of these right now, but the fire could start rather than Model 3, which delays both of them. If we said, let's get moving on DPW, looking at what that does in terms of drawing down. Then my second question is the bar, if you go to any of them, the continuing actual debt schedule to me looks low. And I know I raised this at an earlier meeting, and your answer was that you just used the debt we've actually taken on and incurred. That
no, so debt and authorized debt.
and debt and authorized debt, right? So the library debt is in here, But
Yep.
some of the other big projects that we have in the 5-year plan that we're going to be debt financed, I don't think are. And I was just
So,
going
so
back.
can I answer that, Kathy? Because I was looking at the last year's capital, and I was looking at what our debt schedule that has both projected debt and and um, a current issued debt. And one, we have a lot of we don't have a whole lot of debt right now, just because that's sort of been the the way we've been operating to allow for these projects. And two, if I look at the debt schedule that was presented in the capital plan and the debt schedule that was used to compile that green bar of existing debt. And when it says existing debt, it means both the projected debt, meaning authorized unissued, and existing debt. Those numbers are actually within several $1,000s of each other. And it's just because the projected amounts between the 6 months between when one thing came out and another thing came out, the end of last year and this year, people did different estimates. The difference in those two numbers is about $20,000. And I could change it again by $20,000 based on, new market information or when we're going to start borrowing the debt. So I just wanted to say that it is really in there. What's not in there, and I think that needs to be talked about, is in the existing ongoing capital. When you look at the 5-year projection, there's like like $6 million in the year, and some of that is borrowing and some of that is cash capital. Most of it is cash capital and some of it is borrowing. Those projects, that's where the decisions need to be made. Like in the outgoing years that are not in the debt schedule of the capital plan, but are in the 5-year plan, the projects that have not been approved yet that we kind of know are on the horizon. And so those are not in the debt at the end of the debt of the capital plan, nor are they in this. But it is all part of what is that that sort of yellow ongoing capital. So that would be any new debt that we're taking on needs to fit into that 3 million plus any cash capital. So I think that's where sort of the conversation needs to be.
Okay, I just want to follow. I had Bob, I think we had the last page of, we had an actual and projected debt, and I understand what you just said, but what caught my eye was you have the green decreasing, and we never saw the green decreasing. And even we had plugged in, meaning the capital planning group, had plugged in DPW at a lower number, and it was coming in 2028 with a big jump up in the debt. But even
right, so all of the 4 projects are pulled out of that part in order to give the green debt, because we don't want to count them twice, right? Because they're in here in a different way.
Right, but
and
if I subtract DPW off, I'm still not seeing a decline in general debt. So my question is about the 3 million for everything else, and that we have some fire trucks coming on. We had Crocker Farm roof. We had some big ones coming in at this 10. And so I'm not asking you to answer this right now, but I think we have to, if we've got some important capital outlays that can't be postponed, whether it's in the I think a 10-year, I mean, Bob was on JCPC, so this, we had some big ones coming in the 5-year period. The 10-year period was a little less clear, and some of those in 2028, 29, even as we sat and looked at them, weren't as clear that they were essential. There were some part, but just trying to get a sense of, is that green really going down? Because if it's not going down by that much by things we had planned, like we had a big replacement of the communication system between fire and police, where we only booked the debt for half of it in the year we just did, and then we were going to come back this JCPC to do the rest of it. And so it was not yet authorized, but was planning to be authorized. So I'm just trying to get a sense of how we,
Right. So Kathy, none of anything that's not authorized is not in that green. It has to be absorbed in the orange.
right? So we can't really reconcile the actual and projected with this, because that last page of the of the capital plan included projected with the projects as we knew them at that point. There's a
No,
fire.
it actually doesn't. It
Okay.
actually doesn't. Those are just authorized debt. That
Well,
2 million gets down to like 1.3 when you take out the library, because you don't want to count the library twice, and you take out the school.
okay, I'm not looking at the school because it wasn't in general fund debt. So you're taking library and DPW out of this, but you're keeping pumper truck and some of the others in. Is that
Yep.
what you're saying?
Mhm.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd have to go back and
Yeah,
so
yeah,
Yeah.
we have to look at this appendix B again, Kathy, and back out the buildings that are in it.
Yeah. So if we back out the buildings and then just, I noted this before, and I know you can't answer it right now, but the library funding for the 15.8 is clearly in here. We have some short-term debt we're going to have to finance as the rest of the library money comes in. And this is just penciled in now at 50,000 in that bond anticipation note. And we were told when we voted on it, a significantly higher number for 2 years worth. So I just would like to make sure that.
So I guess
Okay.
I disagree, Kathy, because so short-term money is not, wouldn't have a principal associated with it. So we can borrow short-term money for the library if they need, a gap or a bridge loan until they can get their fundraising in place, if that's what they intend to do. But we would never pay principal on that because that's their responsibility. So the cost of short-term debt is, first of all, significantly less than long-term debt. And we would, work towards, I would assume anyway, that we would work towards spending the money that we do have in place first before we got to the point of having, which would give them time to get their financing in place. And so
if
what's
that's
in
just
that green is about 60,000 of short-term debt, and it's short-term debt for multiple projects because we sometimes never go to long-term debt on some of our smaller borrowing.
Okay. We were told a bigger number, and it wasn't the principal side I'm looking at, it was the interest side. So, but that's, if it's in here on some level, it would,
Yeah.
I just want to make sure that as we're trying to make decisions about these and then go back to what does 3 million for everything else mean? And then I see Mandy's hand is up. I have one more question and you can answer it later. At one point, well, way back when Sean was doing this modeling, he talked about we could draw down some money out of the general reserve. And we've got it set at 10%. We could get it down to 8% or 7% as long as the plan was to go back up. And what I don't remember is where that starts to be dangerous. I mean, I know your last model takes it all, but is there both the capital reserve fund, which may be getting bigger over time, and some portion during this crunch period when the buildings are being financed, that we could pull more than $11 million as long as we were replenishing it in the general reserve stabilization fund.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that was
I
one where pull it down to 8%, pull it down to 7, because we stretched it to go up to 10.
Right.
So,
And so I think that this past year, just as I was coming in, we didn't actually move any money into the general stabilization this year because we were at that 10%. We were slightly over by a few $100,000, to be quite honest with you. And so I think that, going down, a lot of these plans take more than what we have in the capital stabilization. And I think that it's absolutely reasonable to use that in the short term as we build it back. But I mean, I guess my hope is that, every year when we do get the free cash, and we hope that there's always at least some, the idea is to try and get back to that 10%. So if in some of the early years, we go against that, I wouldn't feel uncomfortable with that at all either. I guess I would agree with Sean in that, and a lot of these models, with the exception, well, half of them, 2 of the models do use significant amounts of that regular stabilization account.
okay, I see Mandy's handed up, Bernie, so I'll stop monopolizing and and turn it back over.
Councilor Haneke.
Thank you. My comments are going to be all over the place, but I want to start by saying again, I noticed this and noted it the last time we reviewed the capital improvement plan from FY25, that Appendix B lists the Crocker Farm roof replacement twice too, which is a significant number starting in FY27 of borrowing, since it duplicates 3.6 million over a couple years twice. It duplicates that and all. It would be very helpful to back everything out that's not that's included that's in this Appendix B. Just getting a line item that is only what would need to be covered by the yellow graph in the 4 models. So back out whatever's in existing debt, back out the Jones Library, back out the Public Works replacement, back out CPA, Water Enterprise Fund, back it all out, back out one of the 2 Crocker Farm roof replacements, so that we can see a little bit better what debt that was on this 5, 7, 8-year plan or whatever would be part of the yellow part of these models. A couple of things that have struck me with these models, that the delay the project start dates, model 3, doesn't really delay when we have to dip into capital stabilization. It delays that by 1 year. Instead of starting in FY27 to use capital stabilization, it starts in FY28. Yet it goes just as long as model 1. FY37 or so. Maybe, with a couple, when it's really low, I kind of ignore it because it'll probably be covered by other things. But so I'm sort of looking at, in that sense, then models 2 and 4, the 2 quote cheapest models on overall cost, that also are the shortest time that we have to, that are capital numbers, that black line of capital allocation is shortest time where the capital allocation is not sufficient to even cover 3 million in ongoing capital, such that we need to use reserves. Model 2 covers our capital stabilization reserves are more than Model 2 right now. Obviously in Model 4, our capital plus general stabilization doesn't quite even cover the 23 million, but that makes me wonder, in the financial orders that we have not passed, and that we reduced, we could put another 500,000 or so into the capital stabilization. Right now it's being left in free cash, or we could supplement capital cash capital for FY26 with that. How do we, in these models, how can we, which begs the question in my mind of when we've had 5.7 million in reserve, in surpluses, 6.1 million, 4 million, 2 million, how do we, or how can we account for possible surpluses even before that FY27, right? Because even in the earliest models where we have to dip into reserves starting in FY27, we will have closed out FY25 and 26 and potential surpluses there before we even get there. And how can we account for that possibility in what model in making a decision now as to what model to go forward on? Because if we're adding, this year alone, we put 4 million into capital stabilization. 2 more years of that, by the time we get to 27, we're at 20 million in cash to do model 4 basically just fine with just using about 3 million in general reserves, general stabilization. So now that I know was a boon year, but this model 4 to me doesn't look as dire as it may be stated as being, because we have, before we even get there, 2 more years of potential surpluses to accumulate, as well as interest on all of this to accumulate. And that model gets us back to sort of even in terms of capital spending versus not the quickest. We only have 4 years where we're using reserves or so in that model. And then we start being able to less crunch our ongoing capital expenses there. So I guess my biggest question is there a way we can see something between model 2 and model 4 that takes some guess as to how much in surplus we might have that goes into each of these stabilization funds every year?
So, Counselor Haneke, I am going to have to call you out on, you told me not to make any more. So pick a side. I didn't project that. And so my honest response to that is, I don't like to borrow either, and I think that if the next few years show that we are amassing large amounts of surplus, and we put them in our stabilization accounts as we have in the past, then, certainly we don't, just because a borrowing authorization is made does not mean that we need to borrow that full amount. And I think that, that with your guidance here and the town manager and our comptroller Holly and our treasurer Jennifer LaFountain, we would say, hey, we've got, let's say, 10 million that we could pay down directly on one of these major capital projects instead of borrowing the full amount. I think that is something that we would sort of present to you, because we would have to withdraw that money from the capital stabilization account in order to do that, the same way that we did for the school project. So I guess my thought on it is, if we went with, let's say, model 2, and we all of a sudden found ourselves with a surplus of cash, either because we had high free cash in years 25, 26, and 27, that we might say, let's, instead of putting this in capital stabilization, put it directly to the fire station project. Or if we should get this miraculous gift that was for one of those projects, we would obviously use that instead of our reserves. So I guess that's my thought on it. I mean, we could try and project what might happen, but I think what would be more helpful is to say, we're going to go with, I'm going to use model 2 because that's my favorite, but you know, I have my bias, here it is. And with a caveat that should capital stabilization go above, pick a number, we would use that to pay cash for those, for portion of those projects. Does that make sense? Or is that even helpful? Or do you really want me to guess on how much reserve that I'm gonna get when you told me not to?
Well, I guess it makes some sense, but then I guess my question is, why do we have to pick a model now? If we have to make that decision in 2027, say,
I
why
think
do we need a model now versus just saying move both of them forward expediently, and when we need to borrow, we'll talk more about how much. I guess that's where I'm struggling. We're being pushed to pick a model that in 2 years when the borrowing starts, so we have to borrow it then in FY26, but we'll have one more year of surpluses and end of year budgets known at that point, and more updates on capital stabilization and balances. So why do we need a model decision now than in another 8-9 months?
so. I will say that it's because what we want is the borrowing authorization so that we can go out to bid for a contract, because we can't sign a contract to start work, and we you know, just like the school project, we have this huge authorization for the project. We haven't spent most of the money yet, right? It's just there to, so that we could execute the contract. And if we don't have to borrow all the money, we won't. But in order to move forward, and I guess you're right, you know, in some ways, do you have to pick one or the other? No, but I guess what I think is needed is a decision to move forward, and a recognition that a decision to move forward on all of these 4 large projects at the same time creates a limitation for our other capital. And that we were aware that we're going to try and live within that limitation, and to be eyes open on, you know, that what does this mean for the Crocker farm roof? You know, like what, you know, like we need to have that conversation, and that when you make the decision, you don't want to make the decisions to move forward on these projects and not recognize how that impacts a replacement of a truck that we need tomorrow.
Thanks.
Councilor Haneke, my thoughts are Model 2 is a little more conservative than Model 4. Model 4 is throwing the dice a little bit more. And I agree with you in that we don't have to lock in Model 2 forever. You know, we can start with Model 2 and Model 4, whatever. We can start with a model, and then, you know, it really, the only thing that matters is when we break ground on the projects, and when we, you know, what the cost of the projects are, right? I mean, then we can figure out which path to fund everything works best. And I agree, though, that the constraint of 3 million for other capital projects is something that we need to really think about and really be willing to live with. Does that make sense?
I mean, it
Jesse?
all makes sense. I'm just still contemplating.
Okay. Bernie?
Yeah, thanks. Who was it that says the best game plan doesn't survive the first quarter? Because that's what we're looking at. And, you know, I would agree that Model 2 is the more conservative, if you will, a more certain approach to this. One prosaic reason for why do we need a model is because people are going to ask for it. Folks are going to want to know, show us how you can do this. Well, these models show different alternative scenarios, and let's all admit that things happen, accidents happen. Some of them fortunate, some of them not. Finances change, life changes. So we're going to move forward, and we can walk and chew gum at the same time. If we need, we start off with one plan, and we need to modify it as time goes on because things have intervened. Then that's what we're going to end up doing. And I agree with Melissa. I mean, we need to have some authorization here so we can move forward on this. The delay scenario, to me, is should never have been there. I understand you have to do options, but we've been talking about these projects. I mean, I've been involved with town government probably for the last decade, and we've been talking about these projects before I ended up working in finance committee or town meeting or any of this stuff, well before it. And delay is not a good option at all. Things only get more expensive, both in terms of the cost of the building and borrowing. So let's not even talk about delay. Let's go back and focus on what we can do, which is, I think, is Model 2. I mean, we've already compromised the DPW plan by having a smaller central DPW in outlying facilities, which will be built out over time. It's going to prove to be more expensive and more difficult to operate. But that's a choice we've made because we can't seem to find a place to put the DPW. We do have a place to put the fire station. And as a colleague of mine from the previous finance committee, when we talked about this at town meeting, made the suggestion that we should consider the possible sale of the central fire station. Is that likely to be phased out? Consider the sale of the central fire station and the proceeds from that going to help fund the new fire station. We also have down here in South Amherst, we also have an old school that's sat empty for some time. I think it's the town's property. There's another potential sale of property that can go to help offset some of these capital costs if we need it. I should have put the disclaimer first because I know the next story will be Kubiak says sell the central fire station. So let's just pick a point and move forward. And I'll put my money down on Model 2. I'll put my vote down on Model 2. I'm in agreement with Melissa and what she's had to say about moving forward. I'm also assuming that if we have to do any interim borrowing, we're going to be using State House notes, which are cheaper than going to the private sector for funds. So I don't know if that was the interest rate that was used in doing any kinds of calculations for temporary funding or bond anticipation notes, but that might be a more economical way to approach this. Thanks.
Yeah, Bernie. Kathy?
Yeah, can you put Model 2 back up?
Yep.
Just back up one. So a couple comments. What Mandy was saying was, do we have to choose? If we're choosing Model 2, it's got the fire station, DPW starting first, then the fire station, a year later. So we don't have to, my understanding is we would not go out for an authorization till we have a design that we think can come in at the price tag. It's the school. We didn't go out until we knew it was going to cost. So if DPW comes in first, and let's hope it comes in at 35,000, that's the first authorization we would see. We wouldn't have to authorize both the fire station and DPW. We might be doing designs for them. So this is where Mandy said, we don't, we'll be a year into this in 2026 when we have a really good handle on DPW. So the other thing is that 11 million, if that 11 million is now 12 or 13, it helps a lot to beef up the rest of capital. That 3 million could be bigger, in terms of what we do or the drawing down. And then my final question is, if I go out to this, it's minuscule and I may not be alive when we actually get there in 2037 or 2038, we're below the black line. So that's starting to say that 10.5 is more than we need. Is that correct, Melissa?
Right,
that-
yeah, so in 2037 and 2038 is when it can go, we have more than the 3 million available. Like that, by that point, at that time, that's really probably closer to 3.5, 4 million by the time we get out that far, because it's growing slightly every year. So it's not even 3 million, but it's growing at 2.5%, but it could grow faster. Once we get out of that, the need to supplement that capital budget with the capital stabilization.
Yes, so I think it's important to be thinking that, we're back to, we may not need 10.5 is the other way of thinking about it once we're over this hump. But I would very much like to see what Mandy asked for, was this Appendix B with remove the Cropper Farm roof being in twice, remove all the CPAC community and the things that, and enterprise funds to just do general fund debt, remove the two big buildings. And then to see what we have that might be at risk. Because the thing everyone should remember, last night, no, it wasn't last night, Monday night, what's not in here is roads. It's not, the cash capital part of everything is not in here. So in the 5-year plan that we're looking at, roads was put down at 500,000 a year to make it possible to bring in the library and DPW. I mean, those were both in the projections in that 5-year time horizon. So I would just like to see, I could do it if I had the Excel spreadsheet, but all I have is a PDF and I probably could convert it. But just to get a better sense because of what else is out there. There is the regional debt. I don't know where it sits here, but it is in the 5-year plan going up to $800,000.
So it's
It's
in
in
the
here.
it's in the green number.
It's in here, yeah.
It's in the gray number, so it's still in the going up to 800, and we just saw a potentially higher number out 4 or 5 years. So I just want to make sure that if we've got some big capital out there, that we've got enough room for borrowing capacity for it within the 3 for everything else. And I doubt we would borrow for $500,000 a year on roads. I mean, we've tried to avoid doing that. So it would just be helpful to get Appendix B redone to remove some of the rows, to get down the duplication and the buildings, to understand what we're looking at, that at least as of a year ago, or not quite a year ago, a half year ago, we thought was the world looking forward. So my thinking on all of this, Bernie, on being practical, is I'd like to get to work on DPW as soon as we can. So I want to make sure we can say yes to at least authorizing that. And the delay since I've been on the council is where to put it. We were all ready to move on it, and it needed a bigger piece of property, and we didn't find one that works. So now we've got the compromise with more than one place. So the delay wasn't a purposeful delay, other than driving all over the place, trying to find a piece of land that worked. So I also think Model 2 looks good, but it's partly because that 11 way down at the bottom, what Melissa said is that 11 could be bigger during a few years. We can draw down on the stabilization fund to make this 12 or 13 to not be as crunched for the 3 million for everything else. But you just can't do that for very long. You could just do that for a short period. So that's the way I'm reading this interactively with, there's another pot of money that we could draw some on to get us over the worst period of this. And that's why I asked originally, the fire station wouldn't have to happen the year after DPW. But if we could say we'd like it to, then we can look at it a year from now and say, does it still look feasible to do that? Because we're basically saying move on them, but they don't have to be attached at the hip in quite the same way. So I'll stop there, but I would like to, if we can get, if you can, well, I know you don't like to send me the actual worksheets, but Appendix B redone to remove some things to just show us what is in the authorized, or at least the potential. That would be great.
Okay, Bernie, Councilor Walker has her hand up, so I'm going to go to her first and then I'll go to you. Okay.
Sure.
Okay, Councilor Walker.
Thank you, Bob. I have a question first and then a couple of comments. I'm just wondering the ongoing capital section, what does that account for?
So Alicia, it accounts for all the new stuff that comes in the capital plan. So it allows for 3 million plus a small inflator of 2.5% to be paid. Most typical for Amherst is cash capital. So this would be our new DPW truck, maybe a fire truck, maybe a IT upgrade. You know, the smaller capital, it includes roads, quite honestly. So the kind of capital that we do in the capital plan each year. So the ongoing, you know, maintenance of infrastructure for the community that is not already obligated. So the stuff that we know is coming and we're making decisions about, do we buy a new police cruiser today, or do we put that off for another year, or do we get that that we did a infrastructure, like a wiring broadband kind of infrastructure upgrade that IT did a few years ago that, you know, we're finishing up now. So, you know, those kind of things, that's what it's for. All the new requests that are coming in, quite honestly, right now from the community and the departments on what is it that their departments need to continue to maintain their fleets, keep their buildings running, that kind of thing.
And Alyssa, if you look at the capital improvement plan, you'll see each year, 26, 27, 28, there's a list of police cars, trucks, IT, and buildings, building repairs. It's this long list, hoses in trucks.
Okay, thank you, because that was going to be my my next question about how we came up with those numbers, if they're assumptions based off of projects and items that we already are aware of, or is it just a number that we're projecting and it could fall anywhere in there? It could even be above there. And how we're sort of determining that. And then one of my other concerns, or something that I think should be a consideration, is thinking about what practices or lack thereof got us into the position that we're in right now. So how did we end up with 4 major capital projects that need to be done all at the same time? And I would even argue that there are more than 4 that should be being done at the same time. And I know that it was, you know, a mixture of multiple things, some being sort of not taking care of regular maintenance for these buildings. And so, is a plan for regular maintenance of all of our infrastructure embedded in this model? And in what way? Because how are we making sure that we're not just fixing these buildings to then, in X amount of years, if we don't have regular maintenance, have to then address huge issues like this again? And how are we making sure that we won't have other critical town infrastructure that will come up on these exact same issues of needing huge sort of investments in order to be usable for the town? Are those things being taken into consideration when looking at this model? And if so, how, like, where do I see that?
So if I could, those are great points, Counselor Walker. And so what I would say is that the $3 million number is just a number. I just put it there. And that is sort of when I was, looking at scenarios, I thought we could manage. That was the number I thought we could manage. The truth is that our typical ongoing capital is typically double that. So that when I say that hard decisions need to be made, that's what I'm talking about. And you're right that this model does not take into account the problem of how we got here, which is delay. We've delayed, we have deferred maintenance on a lot of infrastructure in town. And this, what it says is that we have $3 million to continue ongoing maintenance of the buildings that are not being replaced, and that, in that, after we get past that first 10 years, as Counselor Haneke and Counselor Shane have pointed out, we will get beyond that $3 million where we can sort of make bigger capital decisions to maintain our infrastructure. But this model does not address the deferred maintenance that the town of Amherst and most communities in the state of Massachusetts have.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I think Kathy may have asked for this, but I think if there is somewhere where you can access a list of what those at-risk excuse me, projects or expenditures might be, I think that that would also be an important consideration. And I do see that, like, we will at some point in the future be able to go above that 3 million mark. But what is the plan for the period of time where we cannot? And are there projects that we anticipate to come up in that time that will be critical and should not be continued to be delayed? If I'm sort of articulating myself well, those questions I think could also be answered just by looking at a list of what's at risk. And I feel like for myself right now, considering what I've heard throughout this conversation, I still feel slightly uncomfortable choosing a model now. And I would almost like to just revisit Mandy Jo's question as to, do we have to choose right now? And I know some finance committee members did speak to that, but I think I would like to have a better idea as a whole, as a committee. Is this a decision we are thinking we need to be making now? Is this something we want more information on? Or what sort of general process are we intending to follow here?
So, Councilor Walker, I was not intending to make a decision today. I don't think we have enough information to make a decision. I just wanted to start the conversation. And I think that, who knows what the finance committee is going to look like in January. We're going to have to take it up again in January with whoever's on the committee. Does that answer your question, or does that?
Well, yes. I didn't think we were making this decision today. Literally, it was more of a figure of speech. Like, is this a decision we need to make in January, February? Is this a decision that we can sort of wait? And can't exactly recall sort of the marker of time where we said that these decisions will come more into play. But in the next X amount of time, will we just be gathering information and looking at trends? Because also it seems to me that a lot of these things, and as for most financial models, are based off of assumptions that we actually have no idea how any of these things are really going to go. And so at what point do we say we have enough information that we are almost certain that this is how things are going to go? Or are we just going to sort of push forward on the assumptions that we are making?
Well, I hope we revise our information as, revise our assumptions as information becomes available to us. That's kind of a wise way to approach things. But at some point we're going to have to, we're going to have to authorize debt, and the council's going to have to authorize debt. So at that point, we'll be. I don't even know if we'll necessarily have to choose a model at that point in time, but we definitely need to authorize the debt.
Or at least one of the buildings, Bob. That's what I was
Right.
saying, that
Yes.
the first one, yeah.
Yes. Okay, Bernie, I said I promised I'd go back to you.
Yeah, I'm going to be, I'm going to, sarcasm is one of the services I provide. So I'm just going to say that if we have to wait until we know absolutely or for certain how things are going to go, we'll be having this conversation 10 years from now. One of the reasons why Amherst has been in the fix it's in is people have steadfastly said, we need more data. We need more data. We need more data. At this point in time, we've got the best information we can. And I agree with Kathy. I think we don't necessarily have to authorize borrowing on both buildings, but we need to move forward. One of the things we need to take into account, and it's intangible, is how our employees believe they're being treated by this ongoing delay in trying to give them decent working conditions. Seriously, if OSHA came in and took a look at our highway garage, they're likely to condemn it. And we'd have to fix it right away. So the fire station has had complaints concerning employee safety in the fire in the central fire station. So we can't afford to sit around and fiddle anymore. We simply can't. So I would also say, given my sarcasm gene here, we're supposed to get $5 million back from the elementary school project when we get all those energy rebates. And I frankly think that's going to go away January 20th. But if we do, if lightning strikes and we do get the money back, that can go to into that, get added onto that $11 million figure in Model 2. But I understand it's very difficult. On a personal level, it's very difficult to make a tough financial decision. On a public level, it can be even more difficult because you've got any number of thousands of people who will be impacted by it and who will have questions one way or another. But at some point, you got to fall off the fence. And I think we're long past that point.
Thanks, Bernie. Andy?
Well, first, to go back to Alicia's question as to how we got into this, I think it's worth remembering that back in the period 2007 before, there was a real bias that dominated to keep the capital down to an extraordinarily low level of 4% or 5%. It was around that level. And there was no way that we were going to be able to maintain our buildings and build new buildings when you had that low an amount. And of course, you can imagine what the debate was. You had a sum of money that's available, and you have to spend some on capital, and then you get to spend the rest on operations. And all of those operations things, everybody kept saying, that's more important, that's more important. So that's how town meeting was dealing with it back at that point in time. And then around 2008 or so, when John Musanti became the finance director, he started pushing towards developing the policies that we have, the financial um, goals and policies that we now operate from. And one of the things that came that was in that discussion, and I was that was just when I joined the original finance committee, which is why I've lived this history. Uh, the push was to try and get the number to a more reasonable rate, and we decided on 10% at that point in time, but we felt we couldn't change to 10% in an instant because the amount that you would have to penalize the operating budget um, uh, uses would be so great at a single time that it was not going to be politically wise or manageable. So the decision was to increase the amount for capital by about 0.5% a year for each year, and to get it to go up. And of course, and then it was delayed a little bit by the 2008 recession and what happened in the few years after that. So it was a long process, but it was only about a year ago that we finally got up to 10% and actually went 0.5% higher. And we're paying for it now. There's no question that what we are dealing with today is paying for the prior decisions that were made and were recognized to be unwise. But we are where we are. And so that's my first thing that I wanted to comment on. The second thing is that I think that we need to maintain the capital where we are, and I think that there's a consensus to do that, because her second point was, what are we doing to maintain these buildings after we build them so we don't get into this same hole again? And we're not going to get there without continuing to exercise appropriate discipline. Whoever is on the council and going forward, maintaining the proper discipline to keep the amount at a level. And I then, as far as getting to the models, I appreciated Melissa putting forward 4 models for us to think about and 4 different approaches. But I always assumed that we weren't set in stone with just picking any single model, and that we would either modify or blend models as we go forward in the discussion, but we needed the models to start with. And I think that's kind of what's being recognized in today's discussion, and I appreciate that. So.
Thanks. Councilor Haneke?
Yeah, I'm leaning towards a place where we say we're looking at 2 models, Model 2 and Model 4. And we discard the other 2 models and say a couple things: that we move forward on a schedule that starts construction for DPW in FY26 and starts construction for fire in FY27. Get these done as quick as possible. Get them there on that schedule, that not delay anything, move forward. I think we're absolutely right to worry about interest rates. The quicker we can get these, potentially, the better it is. I mean, things are just getting more and more expensive. With final borrowing decisions in about 9 months for DPW and 20 months for fire, I think we just need to revisit both of those models. We'll have more information about what we can afford at what time. I still am seriously concerned about the 3 million, if I did my math right. it leaves about $1 million for all other projects beyond what's on this debt schedule, for about 4 years or 5 years. And then it starts going up through 2030 or so. In my back of the math calculations right now, without knowing and without having done the calculations of what that 3 million looks like in 4 or 5 years at 2.5% increase and all. It's severely restricting, but as Andy just said, we're where we are because prior governments didn't take care of the property. And so we have to do something, and we're gonna have to find a way to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can, so that we can get back on track with our yearly cash capital as quickly as possible, I think, which is why I don't want to just settle on Model 2, because I think if the town remains as conservative as it has with budgeting, we are likely to be able to potentially move to Model 4 without a huge amount of use of general stabilization. And if that's the case, that gets us much quicker onto a path to continue maintaining and not falling behind like we were decades ago. But if they need decisions, I would say we move forward. It sounds like the decision now needs to be, do we move forward and how quickly? And I would say we move forward with models 2 and 4, which are the same speed. And we revisit these as they go, but let's form these building committees. Let's get moving. We've already authorized the schematic design costs for each of these. Let's move.
Kathy?
I agree with that statement, and I do think that we need to look at the 3 million, as Mandy said. You know what? When Alyssa was saying, what is the everything else? Well, if you look at the plan, it was 2 million a year for vehicles. Just as do we not buy any vehicles for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years? Not all that's cash capital. They weren't. I'm not doing fire trucks, which were always borrowed, and then there were other pieces. So that's when I said, and Mandy, what I'm saying is I'm agreeing with you, is I think we have this wiggle room of pulling down some on the general reserve. So it doesn't have to be 3. Could it be 3.5 for a year or two, to get us to, there's something we really need to do that wasn't on the debt schedule. And as long as we're not doing both buildings at the same time, we do DPW first and we take a really good look at this. So I think the DPW building, what we had heard a year or so ago is there was an attempt to think of putting a new roof on the building, and the walls can't hold the roof, as a sense of how what a really bad shape the building is in. That they're no longer, they're not stable, the walls. So I don't want to hold that up, particularly because it's the more complicated of the two. I mean, they're going to have to figure out where the people go, house them somewhere, build a temporary station or piece. So I would like to move as, and that to me, Alyssa, I don't think we're saying this model versus that model. We're saying move forward on these projects. It looks like it's feasible to finance them. I'm hesitant, Mandy, to think that we generate surpluses every year, because that means we're systematically under on revenues. And I don't want to be I want to be as good as we can be without being risky on our revenue projections. But as long as there's some, then we can at least rebuild what I call the stabilization fund. We could, if we have to pull down on that, and this model doesn't have us pulling down until 2027 or 2026. In other words, there are a couple of years. We're only in 2024. The starting point of this is 2 years from now. So, and DPW is, so for me, it would be really helpful. And I think I might be able to figure out how to convert the PDF Appendix B to a table and delete the rows. But that combined with what we thought we were buying in each of the years the 4 years I know about with cash capital. There are some I could see we don't really need to do, Alicia. You know, they were, if we had for these 2 parks or something, but others, roofs, basic building maintenance, those we have to do. And most of those were cash capital. They weren't debt. So that's all what fits in $3 million. And so before I squeeze to 3, I want to know, can we do it? And then I think we've got a way to make the 3 a bigger number. And it doesn't have to be a bigger number for that long, so we could make it a bigger number for a couple years and figure out how to work with that. So that's my view on moving forward, particularly this, now that we have places, we should get those building committees formed as quickly as possible and get to a real design for this. You know, as Mandy knows, we saw one design that was still thinking of why DPW needed all that acreage, Bernie, was that it was all going to be on one floor. Even if it was just one building, it doesn't have to be on one floor. So, you know, so there's, you know, trying to think of what we can do with a footprint of the building.
Well, the other thing that we have to contend with DPW, and maybe not much of, is you know, how much of that site is contaminated and it's going to be needed cleaned up before we do anything with it, because it's been in an industrial use for 100 years.
Yeah.
That's right.
So there's problems, but I'm in agreement that we need to move forward with the DPW, and I do think I'm taking the DPW director at his word when he says it's going to be more difficult to operate on a with the variety of sites. My experience would back him up on that. So I would like to get moving on this. I want to thank Andy too for his references to town meeting, and recall that town meeting refused to establish a construction stabilization fund. Thanks for allowing the interruption, Bob.
Okay,
That's
Andy?
right.
I was just going to lend support to the question of looking at the ongoing capital amount and be more realistic about the ongoing capital, and the ongoing capital commitment needs to be estimated to enlarge by inflation factor, if nothing else. And so I think that some modification might be necessary in order to make these graphs a little bit more realistic, but it's very valuable to have them, and I appreciate Melissa's work in creating them, creating the new versions.
Melissa?
So I was just going to say that I can get you a list of what makes up what's in the graphs here is the green existing debt, and what parts of the capital plan they include and what parts they don't include. And it's also pretty easy because it's built into the sheet that does this design to put a bigger number than 3 million in there. I just didn't do that because it made the amount of reserved used to be a number that I thought we were uncomfortable with, but I can certainly, you know, run that information and show you what it would look like. I think that what was built in there already was 3.5. I don't think it went to 4, but I could go to 4. Like, what numbers do you want me to play with? And I'll tell you how much reserve it will need to get you through those 10 years.
One thing that chart that program may not have, but you can tell us or figure out what to do about it, is that it's not necessarily that we need a flat amount over each year, but we need to have something that reflects inflation, so that when we
so it inflates only by 2.5%, which of course doesn't keep up with inflation. I can make the inflator different if you wanted, but you know, then of course all that means is that it would use more of the reserves.
Well-
you know what and so that was, that was the balance that I was trying to, certainly, like you said, I picked 4 models. Probably none of them will actually come to fruition, right? You know what I mean? Like it'll change, but because there's so many assumptions built into them. But I can certainly, within reason, run a couple more if the committee really wants to know what does it look like if we have 5 million of capital, because that's what we really need. And
Well-
and then that's $20 million with no, that doesn't use the savings that we foresee in, spending down the cash on a major building. I mean, I'm asking, for a little guidance, and I can run a couple other scenarios that speak to what are your greatest concerns, if that's helpful.
Well, at least for me, Melissa, I can mentally compute between Model 2 and Model 4. And that's what I was doing, is drawing more reserves during a time period where we're above the black line. And then I'm bouncing back and forth with what I know about the next 4 years, when we said vehicles and IT equipment, some of the cash stuff, saying, could we live with 3.5? Could we live with 4? Do we need 4 every year? Do we need 4 one year and 3 the next year? I'm not sure we need to have you spend a lot more time on giving us, Model 2.5 or something like that. And
Okay.
because I can think that way about it, and it's more staring at what we have, and we're going to have it in a couple months from you. The beginning of 25 is when we get the list of capital with the 5 years worth of vehicles, IT, and everything else. So at least I'm speaking for myself. I don't need you to run another model, because I can interpolate between these. I'd have, if I'm on the same schedule of building these 2 buildings, I'm going to need this much more money. And if I bump up the yellow bar to 3.5 or to 4, that means I need to pull down more from reserves. So I'm just doing, if I need to pull it down for 5 years, I multiply another 500,000 by 5. And that's how much I'm pulling it down, which is why I asked for general stabilization fund. We can go down if we're going to go back up. So there is some more money there. And then Bernie nicely said, if we really get that 5 million back from the federal government, there's money, so there's potentially more money there a year or 2 years from now, to think about. And we're not going to have any of that for certain right now, but there's potentially more.
Well, there is also several lines that were mentioned, to like the Crocker Farm twice, in Appendix B, that could get knocked out of the schedule, and showing those simple changes would be helpful to it. Like Kathy said, you can just go on the assumption that where you're above the line, you're taking more money from general stabilization.
This is something that you might want to discuss with JCPC next year as you go through the JCPC process, both because you're going to start to be looking at the next round of the 5-year plan, and because it involves people from the schools and the library, and they're going to have to deal also with the tension between operating budget and capital budget, which is really what we're talking about in here too.
Yep.
Okay.
This is very helpful, Melissa, by the way, and thank you
Yes.
for not,
Yeah.
for willing to take every question.
So a wise academic modeler once said publicly that all models are wrong. Some models are useful. I think these are useful.
Right.
All right. Does anyone else have anything else to contribute right now on the issue of modeling for projects? Okay. I think that really gets us through. I don't think we need to say anything about the budget guidelines. I think the council voted to accept them with modifications, and I think that's it. So, but I don't think we need to do anything more on that. Anybody have anything else not anticipated?
About the, because I didn't compare one set to another. The guidelines, the December 9th FY6 budget guidelines we got, is that the final version? Is that the?
No, I'll send you the,
You
there were a few minor changes made at the council meeting. I'll send
Yeah.
it to everyone on the committee.
Because on a quick read through, I didn't notice anything different, but
Yeah, there's just some minor changes.
okay. Yeah.
A few things were cut out, a couple things were cut out, which made sense, and then wording was changed a little bit. So that I think it's actually in the packet for today.
Well, the packet that I'm looking at is what I read. I didn't
Okay.
get a marked up copy. That's what I'm saying.
Okay. It should be marked. Well, anyway, I'll make sure you guys get the latest and greatest. Okay. With that, I guess I need a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Okay,
I'll
Kathy.
second.
Second, Andy. Okay, I'll just go around everyone. Bernie,
Agree.
I'm an aye. Counselor Haneke,
Hi.
Andy,
Aye.
Kathy.
Yes, and happy holidays, everybody.
Yes, Tom.
Aye.
Alicia.
Yes.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and
Okay,
thank
just
again
just
for
to quickly note that Tom and I will be here in January. So if there's any personnel changes, we will remind them of what was said today.
Indeed. Thank you, Bernie.
And again, I want to thank everybody on the committee for a job well done on the budget guidelines, and I think we've had really good conversations, and today's conversation was very helpful. And I think whatever happens, it's been a pleasure working with everyone. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.